Welcome to day 24 of Arthurian April, and today is the second installment in our discussion of Sir Gawain, and in particular, the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You might be able to tell, but I'm quite fond of the color green, so maybe this goes beyond a Gawain thing. I don't know. Dating from the late 14th century, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an alliterative poem. Yes, it's a poem. It has a very specific structure, and there's lots of alliteration. At the end, there's a rhyme called the Wheel and Bob. Now, this harkens back to much older poetry. If you've studied Old English or Anglo-Saxon at any point in your life, you may be familiar with this kind of poetry. It's very intrinsically English, and I think it's some of the most beautiful poetry that you can find out there. In fact, I would go so far to argue, and I am not alone in this, that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight isn't just one of the best pieces of Arthuriana known to exist. It may be one of the best stories ever written in the English language, and that's pretty remarkable. Many critics have discussed all kinds of aspects to it, but you should know, just like with things like Beowulf, which is a little bit different but still not discovered till much later, this poem was not put into print until the mid 19th century. So even though there were extant manuscripts, people weren't reading it regularly until sort of the early Victorian period. And it eventually became the darling of some incredible authors and scholars, not limited to Simon Armitage and the J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, Tolkien, we have so much to be thankful for because of his abiding love of this piece of work. The story is both incredibly supernatural and beautifully real. There's this constant contrast between this ethereal, otherworldly, creepy body horror kind of universe and the very mundane details of living in this world that the author has created. We don't know who the author is. It's an anonymous poem, but we know there are likely some other works that do survive, including Pearl. So sometimes this writer is known as the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet. One of the things I was particularly interested in during my time in graduate school was how curious the discussion of how this otherworldly Green Knight is portrayed in the story, because the description is both this sort of heightened masculine chivalric green giant, but also very sort of long-haired, tight clothing and sort of curvaceous. So a definite sense that this otherworldly being is kind of any gender and all gender. And let me tell you, if you want to get some really, really interesting gender queer theory, go to JSTOR. There's some phenomenal articles, highly recommended reading. Won't get too much into that now, but if you're wondering why my Green Knight in Queen of Fury is non-binary, that's why. And let's just say, I didn't just make it up to make it woke. It was actually supported by the earlier tech. Anyway, as Wilhelm, our friend, discusses, there's two main stories going on in the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So the short version of it is, it's right before Christmas, and this big scary knight who is all green with long flowing hair, so long that it looks like a cape, comes into King Arthur's court as they're getting ready for their feast and says that he wants to challenge one of the knights to chop off his head. Nobody knows what to do, what to say. This is not the general circumstance that surrounds this kind of dinner. But they're so freaked out, and though no one wants to say anything, at last Arthur gets up and sort of starts to say that he'll do it. But Gawain, being his beloved nephew, tells him to stop and says, no, I will do this. And sure enough, he chops off the head of the Green Knight. But to everyone's utter shock and awe, the Green Knight then picks up his own head, rides away, and reminds everyone that, the whole point was that if you cut off his head, that you would then lose your head in a year, and Gawain has to go find him. Gawain has a series of adventures, but finally finds this castle where there is a lord and a lady. And after this initial theme of the beheading, which is something that is not unique to just Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there's also a temptation. So knights follow by, knights with an N, and Gawain is continually tempted by the wife of this particular lord, who, spoiler alert, turns out to actually be the Green Knight in disguise. And the only reason that Gawain's head doesn't eventually get knocked off is because he did not actually fully capitulate to this woman's wiles. You also learn through the story that all of this craziness was orchestrated by Morgan Le Fay, who's described very strangely in the text in comparison to a lot of other descriptions where she's very sultry and very sexual. She's really described as kind of a small, squat, uninteresting woman in terms of the language of desire that we so often see women and sorceresses described in. But apparently, this whole ruse was just to get back at Guinevere for all of her issues, and Morgan wanted to make her so afraid that maybe she would die, or at least get really, really scared. You really get a sense of the magic of this world, but also the lived-in quality, which is one of the things that I love so much about the film that came out in 2021, because it has that same quality. I could seriously write, and I have written many, many words on just how they use the costuming to further the story of the world sort of falling apart, unraveling, getting dirty, far, far different from this sort of pristine Arthuriana that we are familiar with. Interestingly, the story is not about Gawain being perfect. When he gets back to court and tells the story and shows this sash that he gets from the woman that he kissed but did not actually go all the way with, all of the knights wear similar girdles, sashes, in solidarity with him. And that's actually kind of nice because he's still remarkable. He's still chivalrous. He still mostly did the right thing. He obviously didn't die. And in contrast to a lot of the other stories at this point, including Mallory, who's a little bit later, and then certainly all the way out to Tennyson, where Gawain is a total murderer jerk, he's not. He's much more complex and much more interesting. Although the Morgan Guinevere thing is a little weird, I still think it's really cool that all of this is actually being orchestrated by women. And the fact that this woman is also the temptress, and there's all kinds of weirdness going on with there as well. It's not often that you see that much power that gets exerted over a man who is still obviously the titular character, but just kind of interesting. Now, it is written in a much older form of Middle English that I've mentioned before is generally from the northern part of England and still maintained things like the thorn, which is the TH sound that looks like a D sort of with a long stave in it. That's a much older form of TH. So you can see versions of that are pretty cool. And I'm going to read to you a little bit of this particular translation, which is more of a modern version, but just to give you an idea of the feel of this. All colored green were this creature and his clothes. He sported a very tight, straight coat that stuck to his sides, with a lovely mantle on top and a lining within whose fur clearly was trimmed with a facing that was fair, and with elegant ermine embellishing it and the hood, which hung loose from his locks, lying over his shoulders. He also sported tight stockings of the very same color, which clung to his calves, and below cleanly polished spurs of burnished gold set on bases of richly barred silk, and shoelifts beneath his shanks this chevalier rode. All of his gear was, I swear, a gorgeous green, both the bosses of his belt and the brilliant shiny stones that were elaborately arranged on his noble array of his saddle and on his own clothes spun from silk. So much like Chrétien, and very similar to the alliterative Morte d'Arthur that we just talked about yesterday, there is so much beauty in this, so much skill in this particular poem. If you haven't read it before, I highly recommend that you do, and absolutely watch the 2021 film as well. You won't regret it.